Welcome back, everybody. Another edition here of the Auburn Undercover Podcast on the 24/7 Sports Network. My name is Nathan King. Hope everybody is having a good weekend. If you're listening to this one on Saturday morning, we are continuing to run through Auburn's 2022 schedule. We are now on to week 7, where Auburn is finishing up a tough 2-game road stretch. Obviously, they had the 5 straight home games to begin the season. Then they go to Georgia, the defending national champions, and then the following week they will head to Oxford to play a very different team. Talking about generational defense last year in Georgia, now it's a very offensive-oriented team, so that'll be interesting to see how Auburn handles that, playing a very different team with Lane Kiffin at the helm. But this is an Ole Miss team that hasn't beaten Auburn since 2015. They've come close the past few seasons. They had a great team last year, a top 10 team that came into Jordan-Hare, and Auburn won that game. And so this year it's headed back to Oxford. And the Rebels have been a really interesting team this offseason. They've brought in some of the most transfers in the country. Obviously, they've got a bunch of turnover at the quarterback position all over the offense, new defensive coordinator. And we're going to bring in an expert on the Rebels to join us here today, Mr. Tyler Komis, coming over. Am I saying that right?
Yes, sir, you are, Nathan. How you
Perfect.
doing, man?
Good deal. I'm good, man. I'm good. Tyler covers Ole Miss for Rebels247, of course, our sister site here in the SEC West. And so, Tyler, it's been, we talk about the transfer portal now over the past few seasons as, that kind of stretch from February to May where you're really having to be on your toes and watching out for moves. In Ole Miss's case, probably more so than anybody because they just, them and LSU brought in a ton of transfers on both sides of the ball. We'll get to that a little bit later. First thing I want to talk about was as we've gone through these scheduled previews, we talked about last season starting off. So Ole Miss had another great season under Lane Kiffin. Obviously, they make it to the Sugar Bowl. Matt Corral goes down in that game, but it gave a little bit of an interesting window into what that quarterback competition may be. Just what were the vibes from last season and the overall reaction from what Ole Miss did in 2021?
Nathan, you hit it right on the head. They got towards the end, they got a little sneak peek of what this year could look like with Altmaier at the helm. But, I think maybe around the nation, it felt like an overachieving season. But Ole Miss really, inside the program, they really don't feel that way. And they feel they want to keep those expectations for another great year this year. And another thing you mentioned was the transfer portal, and it's been really busy for Ole Miss. Obviously, at one point, it was ranked the number 1 transfer portal class, and people in Oxford like to call Lane Kiffin the portal king. So at the end of the day, we'll see how this team, all these new pieces mesh together, and we'll take it from there.
So year 2 for Kiffin, he goes 10-3. It's his third 10-win season as a head coach. In the past 5 years, he had a couple over there at FAU. But like you mentioned, so we'll start there with the transfers. Tons of turnover. Matt Corral was not a transfer. He's off to the NFL, but they did dig into the transfer portal and get a guy in Jackson Dart to come in at quarterback. Who are some other names, though? I know there's a bunch across the board. I like Michael Trigg a lot at tight end. I think Zach Evans is an underrated player. But who are the names across the board that you have kind of had your eye on, and what did these guys look like in the spring?
Let's start with the bigger names. You said it, Jackson Dart, USC quarterback, and he kind of came in a package deal with Michael Trigg. So, you don't know who's the starting quarterback up to this point. I think Altmaier might have the upper hand right now before spring practice, but you got a surefire, SEC stud in Trigg, I think. And some of the other names, Deshaun Jerkins from Vanderbilt, safety there. He's I think a pretty big pickup. And Troy Brown, Central Michigan linebacker. He's going to be filling, the void left by Chance Campbell, who ended up getting drafted by the Tennessee Titans this past NFL draft. And Mason Brooks, he's going to be huge on the offensive line, tackle from Western Kentucky. And the last one off the top of my head from Auburn, J.J. Peguas, originally from Oxford. So he's going to get his revenge game week 7.
Yeah, that's an interesting situation. Obviously, JJ, a guy who, like you said, from Oxford, was an interesting kind of gadget player in high school, played almost every position on the field, gets to Auburn, plays the tight end spot, and sort of a jumbo quarterback. It'll be interesting to see. Now, did they see him? He had moved over to defensive tackle last year. Did they see him as a defensive player? Or are they going to try him out at tight end? What does his role look like right now?
That's a good question, Nathan. So
Yeah.
I think they mainly view him as a defensive lineman interior. But you know what? During Ole Miss's spring game, the Grove Bowl, as they call it, he actually caught a 2-point conversion as lined up as a tight end. So, and we were talking to him after the spring game, and he said he's ready for anything, and he sees himself being utilized in many different packages, and that means offense too, I think. So, who knows what tricks they might have up their sleeve for him this year on the offensive side of the ball? But no, primarily interior defensive line.
Okay. Yeah, they switched him over. Nick Eason, Auburn's former D-line coach, is now off to Clemson. The story goes that he came up to him in a workout and told him that he wanted to come to his room because he could make him more money playing the defensive line. And apparently Pegues took that to heart and actually came to the coaches in a meeting. And now, yeah, he's got that NFL potential along the defensive line. I also wouldn't put it past Lane Kiffin with the way he just likes to troll to set up some sort of trick play against Auburn in that game. So that'll
that'd be very on brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, especially they're in a revenge spot after losing that game last season. So the quarterback battle, it feels like every single person we've talked to so far, with the exception of Georgia, as you look throughout the SEC, there's just quarterback competition everywhere. Seems to be a two-man race right now for Ole Miss between, like I said, Jackson Dart, who was a good player last year at USC, but came out and Caleb Williams goes in there. And then Luke Altmaier, who, like you said, they kind of got a flash of him there in the Sugar Bowl. Do you have a lean one way or another at what Ole Miss wants to do, or is this one going to come down to what they do in fall camp?
I think it's going to come down to what they do in fall camp, and I think Lane's going to push his back as far back as he can. Keep these guys competing every single day. But in the spring game, from what we saw there, it looked like Dart at times was too aggressive, and on the flip side, you have Altmaier, who looked too conservative, but did take care of the football. Dart threw 2 interceptions, but also had 2 touchdowns, while Altmaier had no interceptions, no touchdowns, but might have played the cleaner game. And right now, I'll give Altmaier the edge just because he's more familiar with the playbook. Yeah, they got a new offensive coordinator in Charlie Weiss Jr. But yeah, right now I don't see a clear leader. But I'm going to go with Altmaier just because he has a better grasp of the playbook at this point in time. But Auburn has a quarterback battle of their own, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yep. Should be 3-man quarterback race.
Okay.
Most consider Zach Calzada, the Texas A&M transfer. Most consider him to be the leader just because of what he did last season. They got Robbie Ashford from Oregon. He's a fun player. He's never taken a college snap before, but he's an interesting kind of dual threat guy. And then TJ Finley, who finished out last season when Bo Nix got injured. What is the difference between these two guys? I know Altmaier might be a little bit more athletic, but from what you've seen so far, is there much of a difference in terms of what the offense does when either of them is on the field?
Again, I feel like the difference is just airing the ball out. I think there are a lot of question marks around Altmaier's arm strength and whether he can really let it fly or not. And Dart, that's not really the case, but right now, some cons to him, I think, that I've seen is that he just tries to force it too much. And they've said, and Kiffin went on record during a press conference and said, Dart's really had some really, shaky day. He's either really on one day or really off. That, at least for spring practice. We'll see if that changes over the summer. But I've been reading some articles, and I've seen that Dart's been, he's been working over the summer, away from the program with teammates, trying to build that chemistry, because obviously he's got a history and chemistry with Michael Trigg. But what about the rest of the guys? Jonathan Mingo, Jalen Robinson, who's another UCF transfer who I forgot to mention actually, and Casey Kelly.
When you look at this offense moving into 2022, obviously, they've been one of the better scoring offenses under Kiffin, but with these transfers, like you talked about, you've got Robinson, but you've got a guy returning in Mingo, who was a good player last year. That might be one of the better receiver duos in the SEC. What do you expect in terms of production out of this offense? Taking a step forward, taking a step back. How different are they going to look under Charlie Weiss Jr. Or is it maybe just too early to tell any of those things, and you'll kind of have to see what the quarterback looks like?
I don't actually expect the offense to take many steps back. Obviously, with losing a guy like Corral, I think you're just bound to have more turnovers this year at the quarterback position because you don't find many like him. But offensively, I think it's still Lane Kiffin's show at the end of the day. So he's still going to bring out the fireworks, I think. And what's interesting about this team is that if the through the air doesn't work, they got a really, really good run game, I think, upgrading their backfield. And that says a lot because, Snoop Connor and Jerron Ely are both NFL players right now. Ely with the Chiefs and Snoop Connor with the Jaguars. But you said earlier, Zach Evans and another Texas running back, Bentley the fourth. They both had really strong springs. And I think this offensive line group, which consists of Caleb Warren, Mason Brooks, Eli Acker, Nick Broker, and Jeremy James, is going to be a really strong offensive line.
Yeah, you mentioned it there. A couple Texas guys. Evans was a huge prospect, 5-star recruit when he went to TCU. And then Ulysses Bentley, the fourth. People at Auburn might recognize that name only because if you remember when Tank Bigsby was a freshman, Ulysses Bentley was at SMU, and when you were looking at the freshman rushing leaders throughout college football, it was like them two going back and forth. So a lot of you've got a super productive guy, and then you've got a guy with a super high ceiling that maybe once he hits that ceiling could be one of the better backs in the SEC. Moving on to the defensive side now, they did get their defensive coordinator, DJ Durkin. They got him poached by Texas A&M. What kind of differences do you expect there? What did you see in the spring? Is there going to be much of a schematic change? Because, in Auburn's case, they lost Derek Mason, but they're not really changing up the way they're aligning the defense. They're sort of just keeping things going. What do you expect out of that group this season, and what kind of changes might fans see this year?
So obviously Durkin, left for A&M for the same position, but I think people forget he was a co-defensive coordinator actually with Chris Partridge, who's now taken on the full role of defensive coordinator. But they took some big losses this past offseason, losing Chance Campbell, like I mentioned, Sam Williams to the Dallas Cowboys, and Kendron Smith to the transfer portal, Jalen Jones. It just goes on. But I'm not too concerned about what the production of the front seven may look like. I think my only question marks for the defense would be the corners, really. You got returning players, AJ Finley and DeAndre Prince, but it's a really, I think out of all the position groups, it's definitely the thinnest. So, it's tough to say, but I'm going to say they take a couple steps back this year on defense.
Yeah, what is, like you just talked about, obviously Sam Williams finished. If Will Anderson Jr. wasn't one of the best players, maybe the best player in college football, Sam Williams might have been the best defensive lineman in the SEC, but obviously he's off to the NFL. What is it the defensive front being the strength of this defense again? Or I know they've got maybe a couple names back at safety. What are they sort of hanging their hat on this year? As you talked about, they might be working out some other kinks in other spots.
I think their strongest is definitely their defensive front. I think it's their deepest group. They got Jared Ivey in the transfer portal from Georgia Tech. They view him as a pretty big piece this upcoming season. And JJ Peguas, as we mentioned, Cedric Johnson. They also expect him to take a few steps forward. That's who Sam Williams, too, has been pressuring to really take the next step. But yeah.
Yeah, it should be interesting to see. Like it's always when you lose a guy like a Sam Williams, of course, you get that production. You have an opportunity for somebody to come in and take on that role. But he was one of the better defensive players for Ole Miss over the past few seasons. But Ole Miss is starting to sort of develop that rep for itself. You had Kim Dichie a few years ago, probably a couple other names that I'm not even bringing up, but they've had good defensive linemen And we just talked about the potential of, JJ Pegues, a former top 100 recruit, a guy who's got a lot of NFL potential. So we'll see how much hay he can make on the defensive front this season. Tyler, we'll go here before we talk about this Auburn game and the matchup here in Oxford. We'll look at Ole Miss's schedule for the 2022 season. Just kind of your general expectations. I know we're still a little ways out, but it's only a couple weeks now until media days, and we're going to find out what people think in terms of an SEC West finish for this team. What do you see as sort of a feasible record for them, and as their win total goes, do you expect them to go over expectations, under, and what are your kind of general thoughts on this schedule?
Well, leading up to Auburn, you see that the first 6 opponents aside Kentucky, aren't quite up to Ole Miss's par, in my opinion. So it's a good thing they have those 6 weeks to really see who they want at quarterback, because the Auburn game is the start of 6 straight SEC games. That's going to really determine how Ole Miss's season goes and how serious they are about continued success, going into 2022. But I see them going into the Auburn game. It might be a little too optimistic, but I will say 6-0.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then, it really these 6 games really could go either way for him, I think. So it's tough to say. It really is. I'll say that out of the 6, I'll give them at least 4 wins, at least 4 out of the 6.
Yeah, I feel like it's you look at that stretch right there. We've got it on, if you're watching the live stream of the YouTube, we'll do our best to talk about it for the podcast listener. They got Troy, Central Arkansas, a couple nice ones there. At Georgia Tech, that's a bit of a sinking ship, so you feel like Ole Miss should have a good shot there. Then they play Tulsa. They host Kentucky. I feel like that's a nice spot there. Kentucky is the biggest, like you talked about, of that 6-game stretch, but you get it at home. That's really nice. And then you go to Vanderbilt. If you're Lane Kiffin in year 3, you should win that game. I feel like you almost have to go 6-0 there before Auburn to give yourself a chance to punch up toward the top of the SEC. And then, like you said, Auburn sort of represents something in the middle here, and then the second half of the schedule just gets absolutely brutal. At LSU, at Texas A&M. I like that bye week spot for them. I mean, Alabama's Alabama, but you get a bye week before you bring them into your house. I mean, you can't really ask for much better than that. And then at Arkansas against Mississippi State. So, Ole Miss, I think, is viewed right now a little bit upper tier from where Auburn is. Ole Miss is kind of middle to top of SEC, whereas Auburn is at the West, whereas Auburn maybe middle to bottom is viewed right now. But if you're in that range anywhere, if you're not Alabama, there's a ton of toss-up games. And that's why I think the SEC is going to be so exciting this season. Yeah, I mean, you look at it here, and just like Auburn with a 5-game home stretch to start the season, there is a really important stretch here for Ole Miss. And I don't think it's too optimistic by you at all. I think I would probably think they'd be 6-0. That the only one you're talking about is getting a win over Kentucky
absolutely
at home. And so this Auburn game could be a big swing game for them to kind of get some momentum for the rest of the year. And so we'll close with that. I know we're still, I say this on every episode we do on this, but it's like we're far away from this game. We're not going to break down, the individual position matchups or anything like that. But just from Ole Miss's perspective, it seems like Auburn has been a frustrating game for them because they've played well over the past few seasons, but just can't get certain things. 2020 game kind of comes to mind. Can't get certain things or calls, whatever your perspective is, to break their way. And then last season, they had a great offense, and they just kind of dropped the ball in Jordan Heron and came up short on a lot of important plays there. Just kind of what is, the fan base and the program overall, how do they view this Auburn matchup in terms of maybe a revenge spot? And then with what you know about Auburn, not trying to get too deep into it, but just kind of your general thoughts on this game this season.
Huge, man. I think Ole Miss fans view this game as huge. I mean, you said it. They haven't beaten Auburn since 2015, was it, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the past 2 seasons, I mean, you got the last game that was in Oxford, you got the fingertip thing where it was ruled a touchback. But you know what? Ole Miss fans may not appreciate this, but at the end of the day, Auburn actually, I was looking back at it, they ended up punting on that drive, and Ole Miss, had the ball up 27-28. I mean, yeah, it would have been a touchdown if they counted the fingertip rule, but at the end of the day, Ole Miss still had a chance to put it away, and they ended up punting the ball, and Auburn scores the game-winning touchdown on their next drive. And then you fast forward to last year after 2020, that game turns out being colossal, because if they win that game and the rest of the season plays out how it played out, they might have made the college football playoffs. So
Yep.
I think Ole Miss fans are ready to get this, monkey off their back and finally get a win. We'll see if they can get that done. But
yeah, I mean, it in terms of positioning, in terms of where the game is played, in terms of what your opponent is looking like, Auburn's got a lot of question marks. And Ole Miss does too, but theirs are a little different because you've got more of a proven commodity in terms of Lane Kiffin and what he's done. Some of the transfers you're bringing in are, of course, of higher profile. So I think if there was ever a year for Kiffin to get, not just Kiffin, it extends multiple coaching tenures, sort of this frustration that Ole Miss has had in this Auburn series. For them to get this monkey off their back, I think this is probably the year to do it. You're bringing them into your house. And like you talked about, people forget how good Ole Miss was last season and how much they were rolling before they sort of just hit a wall. I mean, I think they were ranked number 10 in the country, but like you said, the way the rest of the year played out and how successful their regular season was, they could have had a shot for the college football playoff at the end of the year. You might have been talking about, them versus Cincinnati or whoever else was up for that number 4 spot. It would have made things pretty interesting. And so great perspective from you, Tyler. Thanks so much for coming on today. I think our listeners are always interested to hear kind of what the Auburn game means to the opponent, because they obviously know what they think. And from you, I'm kind of learning that based on, number one, the schedule, where it comes and what the schedule after this game looks like, and number two, the way the fan base views this game. I think it's bigger than I thought before we started this episode. I think Ole Miss fans maybe view this one are going to be a little more energetic for it than I thought. So should be a really good matchup. Like we talked about at the top, it'll be difficult for Auburn to come off of a 2-game road stretch, but they do get the bye week after that, and then they host Arkansas at home. So Arkansas will be our next episode here on the series. So I want to thank Tyler so much for hopping on today. You guys can obviously go to Rebels247 and check out all their work, and you guys can follow him on Twitter, at Tyler Komis, Komis. So thanks so much to him for hopping on today. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review. That's the number one thing that helps us out. The intro and outro music is by Beats by Mordecai. You guys can follow him on Twitter, SoundCloud, and Instagram. And until the next episode, enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we will talk to y'all next week to preview Arkansas.